Um, Good evening or good early morning for some of you, and thank you very much for joining
Good evening from
for
Kathmandu.
the session. In the session today, we're going to be looking at the legal framework for the protection of people on the move in the context of climate change. Now, you already know this by now, but we very much encourage you to keep the sessions as interactive, and we try to make them as engaging as possible for you as well. So at any point during the session, please feel free to share your comments, to share your reflections. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them to the rest of the group, and you can do so in two ways. So you can either write them in the chat, and we can pick them up from the chat box using the chat function in the Zoom screen, or otherwise, if you would like to take the floor and you're in a position where you can open your microphone, feel free to use the raise hand function by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting raise hands. And then based on that, we will give you the floor at different points throughout the presentation. I am very happy to be joined today by Atle Solberg, who is the head of the Platform on Disaster Displacement Secretariat. Atle is going to be taking the lead on the session today. He will be managing the presentation, and I understand that he will also stop at certain points throughout the session, throughout the presentation, to see if there are any questions or comments from the chat. So let me stress once again, let me encourage you once again to try and make the most of this opportunity. And I know that we have, at the beginning of the course, when we introduced the outline of the course, we mentioned the fact that participation in the live sessions was not compulsory. It was encouraged, but not compulsory. But I think really the added value of being present live is to be able to engage with the speakers that we invite and to be able to get their perspective, to maybe sometimes even challenge them a little bit with your questions and with your comments. So we're very much looking forward to the conversation around this topic during the session today. Atle, it's a big pleasure for us to have you as guest in the course and as guest speaker in the session today. Thank you so much for joining. I will pass you the floor directly, and you can go ahead. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mickey, and maybe confirm that you can hear me okay. Great. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Atle Solberg. I'm joining you from Geneva, Switzerland. I understand that some of you are joining me from afar, the Pacific and the Caribbean, and I find that very exciting. I also saw a colleague from Nepal. As Mickey said, I am the head of the Secretariat of something called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And this is a state-led initiative. We are currently under the leadership of Kenya, and Costa Rica is the vice chair. There are 19 member states of our governing body. And our mandate or our ask is to look into policies and practice that can better protect people that are displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effect of climate change. So we work very much on a policy level. And we do also regional programming, and in different areas. We have work in Central America, in Greater Horn of Africa, in Bangladesh, and in the Pacific, particularly in Fiji. As I said, our aim is to promote the protection of people that are displaced in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change. And primarily, we look at the protection needs of people that cross international border. So when we put the title of this section, the legal framework, I will primarily refer to what type of protection exists or do not exist when people are moving or compelled to move across border in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change. I really encourage all of you to ask me to stop, put forward your questions, and that we can make this session as interactive as possible. Some of the issues are related to protection of people moving in the context of disaster and climate change are unresolved. So many issues related to terminology, legal standards and policies are evolving and needs to be debated and sometimes contested. So again, a strong invitation to you to stop me and also pose questions as we go. We have about 90 minutes for this session. That means we have around 80 minutes left, but I also understand that sometimes the session lasts less. I have a set of PowerPoint slides I aim to go through today. And if Marion can go to the next slide. I will divide this into three segments. First, I will talk a little about climate change, disaster, and what I refer to as human mobility, and what can we do about that. And I will look a little into policy approaches, policy options, what's out there in terms of how to address this issue. I'm just back from the Conference of the Parties in Baku, Azerbaijan. So that is one area where you can think of policy options. What type of policy option can we look for under climate change action, for example? And there are many such examples. The second part is to look a little on what exists of international, in brackets, protection for people on the move in a changing climate. And just to put that up front, there is limited protection for people moving across border in the context of a climate change. So I will come back to what those gaps exist of and what are some of the alternatives in the absence of legal standards in this area. And the third part of the presentation is to look a little into the role of regional refugee law when it comes to protection of people moving in this context. And I would like to talk a little about something called the Cartagena +40 process, which is an ongoing process that will end in December this year with a ministerial declaration and a plan of action in Santiago de Chile. So that is an example where there is quite strong policy development and some opportunities to turn to international or regional standards related to refugee law for the protection of people moving in the context of disasters and climate change. So that's the structure. Again, I invite all of you to come in with questions. You can use, you raise your hand, you can put a question in the chat box, or also raise your hand in the video. So first part, a little introduction to human mobility in the context of climate change and disaster, and some of the policy options we do have available. So first, in the next slide, if Marion can share that video, I want to share with you a definition that it's adopted by the Platform on Disaster Displacement, but it also draws on our predecessor, the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. And it refers to the concept of disaster displacement. And disaster displacement refers to a situation where people are forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence as a result of a disaster, or in order to avoid the impact of an immediate and foreseeable natural hazards. Some of you that are aware of the guiding principle on internal displacement will recognize a lot of this language. A few things I want to highlight you when we look at this definition is the element of being forced. So we are predominantly referring to people that are forced or compelled to move or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence. So no movement is either completely voluntary or completely forced, but our primary focus are on those movements that are predominantly forced, meaning there is less choice, less preparation, and less anticipation for the fact that people are moving. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is the reference to disasters and natural hazards. So referring to people that are moving either because of a sudden onset disaster, such as a tropical cyclone, a hurricane, a landslide, wildfires, etc. It does not refer to those that are compelled or forced to move for example, in the context of conflict or generalized human rights violation. And one reason for that is that the normative framework governing people displaced in conflict situation is very well developed. We have a 1951 Refugee Convention, and we also have strong instrument related to internal displacement. So this reference or this definition of disaster displacement refers to disaster and natural hazards that are not related to conflict. We are also applying a broad understanding of natural hazards. That means an incident of an earthquake or a volcanic eruption is also covered by this definition. And this refers to what we often call geophysical hazards. So it's not only about climate change or not only about disasters that are weather related. The third point I wanted to highlight to you related to this definition is that displacement can also happen as or in anticipation of foreseeable natural hazards. So that means if people are evacuated, let's say a hurricane warning gives people 72 hours to move to higher ground or into evacuation shelters, that's also covered by this definition. And that suggests that there are also elements of preparedness and prevention that can be applied in this situation. And now I really want to invite all of you to pose a question or a comment. So I see Sarah Lins. Maybe you can put on your speaker and we can take it from there.
Hello?
Yes.
I'm going to keep my camera off because of internet connectivity, but my question is about the word foreseeable in this statement, because we have so many forecasts of what is going to change in terms of climate change, but are we talking about sudden onset disaster or something that could be the result of a slow onset change from climate change?
I think that's an excellent question, and the answer would be yes, although it is probably a bit complex to apply it. But it clearly refers to a situation, as I mentioned, a hurricane warning or a tropical cyclone warning, or even a warning around an imminent landslide due to flooding. That means a foreseeable natural hazard, but also situation or process related to extreme environmental degradation. Think about sea level rise or salination of groundwater. And if you reach a point where habitability will not be possible, that's also clearly covered by this situation. I think the conceptual challenge will be, at what point will the situation be as such that people will have to move? So will it, for example, cover a farmer or a fisherman that can anticipate that livelihood will be gone in a couple of years' time, and then take a conscious decision to move before it maybe gets more difficult? Would that be covered by the definition? And that's the question, whether that is covered. And that's where displacement touches upon migration movement, which are more planned and has a more element of choice. But I think this is an excellent question that illustrates the complexity of the issue. So thank you, Sarah. Are you from the Pacific by any chance?
No, I'm based in the northeast of the United States, but I work in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, Latin America, many different regions.
Yeah. Did this make sense to you?
It does. It definitely makes sense, and I think it will be interesting to see how this is interpreted over time as we come up against more and more people reaching that point of non-habitability or livelihood loss.
Exactly, and one of the experiences we have is that these major disasters that are very sudden in nature and displaces a huge number of people, also across borders, it's a bit easier to map and collect data. And also, in general, states are quite generous with admission and stay. That there are many examples where neighboring countries do have open border and provided temporary protection. When the process is more slow onset and maybe reaching a point of extreme environmental degradation, then the solution to that is probably permanent. So you have to permanently move, and that's much more difficult to map because these are slow onset processes, and also it's more difficult to reach a understanding or agreement on how to deal with that at the international level. So these are situations we need to build up preparedness for. We need to be prepared that situation where people will permanently have to move because livelihood, habitability, and things that makes it possible to stay will be gone, and that's maybe one of the major both policy challenges, but also we have knowledge challenges because it's evolving. So that I've given you some time to reflect on this definition, and if Marion can share with us the next slide. I wanted to say that in this area, and maybe the little exchange we had with Sarah, there are conceptual and terminological issues. So this is a definition that has been adopted by the Platform on Disaster Displacement based on what I said, the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, and I can happy to maybe post something in the chat box or later explain where that was coming from. But it does not pretend to be having the one answer to definition or the monopoly of definitions. So very often when we talk about people moving in the context of particularly the adverse effect of climate change, we are reference to climate refugees. Sometimes the term environmental refugees used. You can find example of using the term environmentally displaced persons, environmental migrant, and evacuee. And I think it's important for you to consider what term works for you. Maybe you are working for a government with public policy on this, so don't necessarily adopt the definition I have offered to you. I wanted to pause a little on this and maybe ask if anyone has any comment here, and maybe also ask, would a term like climate refugee be useful, or are there any issues that we may want to think about before we apply a term like climate refugee? So now I want to put you a little on the spot here to engage you.
Thank you, Atle. There is a Philo who wrote a comment in the chat. Would you like to take the floor, Philo? Otherwise, I will read the comments for you, Atle. It's Mohammed from Somalia. Can you take the floor? Perhaps not. So can you see the... Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, so DG Shah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Atle, thank you for your presentations so far at this moment. Getting the things clearly. Yeah, there are the various types of definitions to define the disaster-related refugees and all, right? So in Nepal, there are places where people have been displaced because of the melting of glaciers, right? Like Himalayas are being melted, and then and their professions, their occupations, are dying out, and like they have hard times to get by their living, and so they move from Himalaya to the plain region, right? Like from hilly and Himalayan region to the plain region. So what kind of terminology can we apply to them? Either climate refugee or environmental one, or any specific terminology?
I think that's an excellent example, and I think it's an example where we are under communicating what's happening in the high mountains area, and it's quite similar, if you agree, with what we see in the Pacific with sea level rise, because it's incremental, it's slow, and it affects livelihood in a way that people will have to move. So in one way, you are relatively close to disaster displacement here, because it is a situation where people are left with less choice. But you could also think of what I explained. Maybe people can see this come and they plan. So maybe you are closer to a situation where it's more a migration plan approach. And I think the point of this definition is maybe not to focus too much on which word we use, and rather see what specific needs do these situations generate. So what I'm very often refer to, if there is a sudden onset disaster, a hurricane, maybe what people need is what I say sometimes, a bed for the night. Maybe they need a temporary humanitarian bed for the night, and then can be able to return back when the hurricane has passed. But the situation you explained may lend itself not to a temporary solution. Maybe these people will need a permanent solution because livelihood is gone because of the melting glaciers. So that is the point. I think we should focus on what type of needs are there in the different situation. And that helps us reflect. But I would argue that what we see in the Pacific with sea level rise and people having to move to higher ground, which is very often permanent, is very similar to the situation we see in the Andes, in the Americas, and also in the Himalaya. And what makes it very important to have in mind is that we can quite confidently link this to the changing climate. Glaciers are melting, and it's quite clear that this is an issue which is related to global warming. So we need to also don't forget the issue of climate change as an issue. An earthquake, on the other hand, has very little to do with climate change. So it needs to be probably placed in a different solution framework.
Yeah, it's candid explanation on my question. Thank you. Thank you, Atle.
I think Stephanie had an arm or hand up.
Yes, Stephanie had raised her hands, but then I don't know, Sheila, what? So could you read the comment from Mohammed from Somalia, or would you like me to read it out for you?
I can. If you read it out, that will be helpful.
Okay. So when discussing climate change, Somalia is one of the countries most vulnerable to its impacts, which have resulted in droughts and floods leading to displacement. What policies can help us access climate finance in order to assist our vulnerable people?
Thank you,
Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. That's also a great question. I'm just back for the conference of the parties under the United Nations Framework Convention. It's a big issue, so I will only refer to it here, and maybe we can come back to it. But there is a discussion under the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement to establish, or that was decided last year, a fund for responding to loss and damage. So if it is related to the adverse effect of climate change, there is now a growing willingness in the international community to support access to funding, both as a loss and damage issue, but also when it comes to adaptation. So the answer is, in a very technical way, there are adaptation funding under the convention as well as loss and damage funding. The biggest challenge, and I'm sure all of you have read the news, is that parties to the convention are not able to agree on the level of such funding. So it's a complicated and high level political issue. But these are some of the opportunities. What we normally see is that funding is too little, and the windows for this type of funding is too few. So it's a challenge that we need to work from an advocacy point of view. I see quite a...
So Stephanie has been writing. Stephanie, would you like to take the floor? Can you activate your mic, or?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
I just had the feeling that the discussion is already going somewhere else. That's why I lowered my hand. But initially you were asking our opinion on the terminologies, right? On the slide that you're currently presenting, right? Yeah, I think my main struggle I'm always having with these terms like climate refugee and environmental refugee, I totally get where it's coming from. It makes our our lives a little bit easier if we put a well-known term to a problem. Let's put it like that. However, as I mean, you pointed out, the refugee term, it's not just a mere description of people being displaced, but it has a proper legal definition, and that definition just doesn't include the aspects of climate or climate change and environmental change and so on. And so in the end, it's I always fear that by applying the term too loosely or too easily, that it rather harms those that are actually those that are in need of protection, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I'm always very hesitant of applying these terms.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you, Stephanie, for coming in on that. I think that that's so important, and that issue will stay with us a little later in the presentation. As you said, there is already a well-defined normative framework that provides protection to refugees, and that means you should be careful about including all the categories under that protection framework, such as those moving in the context of climate change, because they are not covered. And what you could risk is that you are undermining existing protection standards. So that's a very good point. I'll come back to that a little. And then secondly, we have to ask ourselves whether it describes well the situation and whether it will give us the protection solution that we are looking for. One important aspect that I really would like you to remember is that a refugee, by definition, is a person that finds himself outside of his country of origin and is unable or unwilling to avail itself of the protection of its own country. And many people, so they have somehow lost the protection by the country of citizenship. But many people moving in the context we are talking about have never lost that protection of its own country. So that's also important, that we should be careful about what we convey by using these terms. So that was excellent, and we will come back to that. I think my point comes back regardless. At least from the platform of disaster displacement, we do not advocate for the use of the word climate refugee. But if it can be used as a matter of advocacy and getting highlight to a situation, you may consider that that's a powerful tool, to highlight the urgency and the forced nature. So again, I don't want to prescribe which terms to use, but very careful using the refugee label, because we already have standards and tools that are very clear on what obligations states have on protection. So Marion, I don't know if there are others.
Yes, there were. Sorry. So we have two actually. So we have Aliyah Williams, who's at work, so cannot take the floor. So he wrote to me some questions. So he's in Guyana, and he said, in Guyana, our capital city, Georgetown, is forecasted to be underwater by 2030. Due to rising sea levels. However, with the introduction of the oil and gas sector, most of this economic activity takes place around the low coastal plain area. As a result, persons may therefore be reluctant to move to higher ground. How do we deal with a situation like this? And then he also added something else. When it comes to the use of the word refugee in Guyana, we do not recognize the status of a refugee in our Immigration Act. So the government is often very hesitant to use this term. So he both answered to the terminology question and also gave as a question about the situation in Guyana.
Yeah, I think that's a situation I don't know that well, and so it's very hard to me to say what to do. But what we need to prepare for is that because of global warming, we will see more sea level rise, and we will see more frequent and more intense disasters. So any population that are in low-lying areas needs to prepare. And it might be possible to adapt and be able to stay in these areas, but it's clearly need to do very proper or thorough risk assessment, planning, and really do scenario projection for those situations. Whether people will be able to adapt and stay. We have countries that are situated below sea level rise. The Netherlands is one such example. So you could think about coastal protection and building up the coastal areas with robust protection or physical protection. So that needs to be seen from place to place. But what I can very confidently say, you need to prepare for that, and it's not getting better if it's a low-lying coastal area.
So thank you. We also have Hanan. So Hanan Hamadi, I want to ask a question regarding the first slide, disastrous displacement. Does this mean it mostly happens outside the country more than within the country? I think he wants to know, yes, the terminology disastrous displacement and about outside or inside the country. And we also have another question still about terminology. So it's Mohammed from Somalia again, and I'd like you to briefly explain how the sea level rise contributes to coastal displacement as well as its overall impact on fishery production.
Yeah. So on the first question, that's also great. It doesn't really, the definition at this level, define whether it's internal or external. It can be both. And then we will have to see whether people cross a border or internal. It's the situation itself is the same. What we do know that most of this type of disaster displacement happens internally. So there are more internal displacement than external displacement. And just to give you a figure, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, acronym IDMC, maybe you want to check that out, IDMC, they estimate that around, in average, 25 million people are displaced every year in the context of disasters. So that's a huge number, seriously. We know pretty well the magnitude of internal displacement, but less the magnitude of external, also because data is poorer and it's also more contested since the category doesn't exist. And then Muhammad asked for, maybe repeat that, Marion, on sea level rise, how it...
Yes, so Mohammed was from Somalia and is asking if you can briefly explain how the sea level rise contributes to coastal displacement, as well as its overall impact on fishery production.
Yeah, on the second, I'm not qualified to say much, but on the first, clearly, what you see and there are different impacts. So one thing is sea level in itself, so water tapping on your door. If your community is located at the beach or at the coast, the sea level rise will itself make intrusion of water. So that we have seen in many countries in the Pacific, there are what we refer to as planned relocations. So communities have relocated to higher ground. So that's what's happening. But there are also other negative impacts, such as intrusion of salt water, which then affects agricultural protection. What we see in places in Bangladesh, low-lying delta, is that you have saltwater intrusion, so you don't have fresh water anymore, and that makes life much more difficult. And then you have secondary impacts, which is salt in the water creates health problems. So many areas in Bangladesh have endemic high blood pressure because there is too much salt in the food and in the water. So in that sense, sea level rise brings with it many negative impacts and lead to what we very often refer to either planned relocation or people individually just moving to higher ground or moving to other cities. A second layer, which I don't want to complicate or make this too complex, is of course if sea level rise has occurred and then you have an annual disaster such as a tropical cyclone hitting an area already more vulnerable due to sea level rise, then the impact is higher again. So a tropical cyclone will be much worse in certain areas today than it would have been 20 years ago, because people have already having their resilience eroded by sea level rise. So many factors come in here and makes it complex.
Thank you. There's another question from Stephanie that we heard before, and she was wondering, did you want to say it loud? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sure, I can come in. Yes, I was referring to what you said earlier when you made a kind of distinction between the sudden onset and slow onset, and the more like kind of the time components, like kind of it's sudden and then you maybe need shelter for a night or two, or rather if it's something more constant and you have more time to decide kind of, and more time for planning, and it's rather a migration decision. But very often I assume that there are also kind of, I mean, the term comes probably more from the conflict context, but more protracted displacement situations, like where we initially expect something to be very short term, where we then see, okay, actually people cannot go back after those 2 nights in the shelter, but maybe it takes a lot longer. So I would assume that also needs or requests a different kind of policy response. So I would be interested what your view on these, like where it's not black or white, but kind of in between or developing, how you look at that and how policy responses could look like in such contexts. I don't know if I was being very clear, but
no, it's excellent, and it's a very excellent question. It really unravel the complexity, right? And I think that's a very important point. We do know that evacuations does not always mean that people can return back, as you rightly said. So my point was more that very often evacuation may mean that people can report back. But what we do know is that people may then end up in a protracted situation, either because your place of origin was damaged and it's not possible to return, or yes, that you can return, or recovery doesn't start sufficiently early enough, and that people move on. And that's a big challenge. And this is from a policy point of view, is that particularly if you look at from the international system point of view, is that this major disaster generally lead to strong response, donor response, resources, but the time span for that is very short. After 60 days or 30 days, people are moving on, assuming that the disaster come and go, and then we can move on. But we know that recovery starts in much more slowly than people assume. And that means that we do find people still in displacement many years after a disaster. There's no attention either from national or international actors, and they are still in a protracted situation. We know that Hurricane Mitch in Central America in 1998, people are still living in marginalized suburban areas, never having found any proper solution. And that's a huge policy gap. And it reflects to what we struggle with in the system, or everyone, this nexus, how do you bridge humanitarian and development and provide solutions? So without going too much into this, that's a challenge for all types of displacement. So when it comes to internal displacement, the Secretary General a couple of years ago developed an action agenda for solution to displacement. So it's both conflict and disasters, and I'll come a little back to that also. But that's an excellent area, and this is where we struggle. Just to give you an example, as I said, I participated in the Conference of the Parties in Baku, Azerbaijan, and we had a side event particularly covering this issue. How do we provide solution, resources or financing or capacity to displacement from a climate change policy point of view? And it's a huge gap. So thank you so much for that. That's great, Marion. Very active participant. I really like we have it there, and I still think we cover what I want to cover, but I think I would like to move on a little and see where that brings us. So just to summarize a little this different situation, and I think we have already covered this. So we have situations that are of more slow onset nature, and we have situations that are more of a sudden onset nature. And we have, for example, sea level rise in Vanuatu, where people have already seen planned relocation, people moving to higher ground. We have seen floods in South Sudan, which are more sudden of nature, but also people moving to other countries. River erosion in Bangladesh is a huge problem, and maybe that's related to, we heard earlier about glacier melting high up in the mountains or the Himalaya mountains. And again, very often, huge challenge related to permanent solution. The three examples at the bottom is also something I want to highlight, because we need to have a broader scope, is that when we talk about disaster, especially, we also refer to geophysical hazards related to earthquake and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions. And our colleague from Nepal, I'm sure you can relate to the fact that earthquakes may have devastating impact and also lead to displacement.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, Kathmandu is really vulnerable. I was very close to the earthquake in 2015. You had one of the latest.
Yes, we had a very terrible earthquake in 2015.
Yeah.
And there was a loss of lives and the property assets, and we called it the Great Gorkha earthquake. So it really affected millions of people, not only the people, their lives and the species, properties, assets, and everything. And so that also caused the mobility, like many people started to migrate to other countries, like for employment, right? Even to India and some of the Gulf countries, like, because many people became poorer. The level of extreme poverty rose up because of the earthquake, right? Many lost the jobs and all. So it has a precarious situation because of these disasters. And so disaster and displacement and migration are intertwined and have very complex relationship and nexus, I think so, as you mentioned, Atle, like how people become displaced and how it affects their livelihoods and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming in on that. And I think that illustrates another complexity, is that you may have a sudden onset or an earthquake, and then that affects the livelihood, the poverty level, and even the notion of safety that people would have to their homes. And maybe that leads later, if recovery is not kicking in, to a secondary movement, which may be more of a migratory nature. And we know that, for example, in Haiti, after the earthquake in 2011, there were spikes in migration figures to neighboring countries the next couple of years. So that generates another process. And it refers back to what I said, what type of solution will then be required? And maybe the secondary movement really need pathways, safe, legal, and orderly pathway for migration, whereas the immediate response was more of a humanitarian nature. Could you, what is your name? Is DJ? Is that, can I call you that?
Yeah, DJ, yeah.
DJ. Do you have any notion of solutions? Do you think that people have, in majority, found solution after the 2015, or do you think still that is an unresolved issue?
Actually, the government established a National Reconstruction Authority, like building back, like the campaign, like how to relieve them and how compensate them. And there were the shared initiatives, both from government as well as private sector and international donors and development partners also had collaborated efforts in bringing the lives back to normalcy. And then slowly, like, people started accustomed to living better, and then people started managing the things, right? But despite that, some vulnerable group, like those who are extreme poor, and then the elderly people, the children, and some people with the persons with the disabilities, they were most affected. And so the government is trying to help them and recover them, and both financially and through capacity building programs are also there. So it's an ongoing process. It takes a long time. One thing is there, actually, this kind of disaster leaves a lasting impact, right? And it takes a longer time to come to normalcy in the long run, right? So
Yeah.
this is yeah.
Exactly, and thank you for saying that. I do not if when I refer to this different situation to say that any disaster requires major additional development efforts to come back on track. That's clear, and that's one of the challenges also for those that were displaced. So this is you're a great crowd. I think we have covered these different situations, some of the complexity of it. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk a little about, somebody asked about Guyana. What can we do? What type of policy instrument do we have? And again, the situation are so different, so there is no one size fit all. But we, in our work, we very often refer to what we call a toolbox approach. So one is to help people to stay. And that's a very important message. Everyone wants to stay where they are. And if they need to move or shall be moving, they would like to have that as a choice and something they can plan. So that is a fundamental principle in all of our work. How can we help people to stay and let them live meaningful way? And then we very much refer to what we can do with development tools, leveraging development tools. That's strengthening disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and generally development of efforts that strengthen the resilience of people. So what we have been talking about, whether you are a farmer high up in the Himalayas, are there tools or policies that we can support so people are able to adapt? And DC told us it's difficult, but maybe we need to really challenge ourselves in those types of tools. Maybe change of livelihood, but again, very difficult. A second part of that toolbox, we are helping people to move. That we need to recognize that risk may reach, or the risk of being displaced is at such a high level that we need to really start thinking of helping people to move. So I refer to these processes of planned relocation we have seen in the Pacific, also to some extent in Bangladesh and other places where people are helped to move out of harm's way and to higher ground. This is particularly in climate change context. But you can also think about people living in marginalized urban areas that are dangerous because they are living on a hillside that is unstable. They're living on a foot of a volcano. So then this notion of helping people to move out of harm's way is very strong. And this is also what we sometimes refer to as migration as adaptation. So you migrate, and maybe that can help your adaptation efforts. For example, you go overseas, you make an income, and you're able to send remittances back, and that may build the resilience and adaptive capacity back home. But that's very complicated and difficult, and we need to make sure that migratory movement is safe, orderly, and regular, and it's really supporting adaptive measure. Otherwise, we shouldn't call it migration as adaptation. And then finally,
ask you one
please come in.
Yeah, this reducing exposure, right? So how can we reduce exposure? Like, could you please clarify a bit about on this?
I'll come to that in a second. So the last bubble in the toolbox is a little, how do we protect those that are moving, that are already displaced? And that is one framework for internal displacement and one for cross-border. So normally we say that the risk of displacement is a function of three things. So it's a function of the hazards. That's can be glacier melting in the Himalaya, or it can be a tropical cyclone. But that hazard in itself doesn't necessarily lead to people moving. If people are displaced or the risk of being displaced will also depend on their vulnerability to that hazards. So if you are running a business that does not depend on water, for example, and glaciers are melting in Himalaya, you may not be vulnerable to that specific hazard. Just an example. Maybe you are running a meteorological observation site that is paid for from Kathmandu. So we need to look at the vulnerability before we consider risk of displacement. And then finally, also the exposure. And we particularly refer to that when people are living in high-risk areas. We have talked about already in Guyana, if people live in low-lying land that our colleague explained to us, then they are exposed to that hazard. If you live on the top of a hillside in Georgetown, you may not be exposed to that hazard. So the notion of exposure refers to, are you in the pathway of a hurricane, or are you in the pathway of that hazard? And the point we are making here is a little that we can do something about all these elements. We can do something about the hazard. What can we do about the hazard when it comes to climate change, for example? So now I put that question back to you. What can we do about vulnerability? What can we do about exposure? DC, you want to answer that? Sorry to put you on the spot. It's okay.
Any volunteer? So, well, some people cannot talk because they are in. I have Abdullah Amar also. He has a question. He's in the library and he can talk. But if any one of you who can take the mic can try to answer to Atle. Can you repeat the question? This way, perhaps will help.
Yeah. What we and this is an important point when we talk about disaster displacement in terms of what we can do, is that we refer to the risk of displacement as a function of the hazards, the vulnerability, and the exposure. And that means if we see displacement, or the risk of displacement is dependent on the magnitude or the strength or the frequency of the hazard, such as a tropical cyclone. And that's important. If there's an Arctic storm on the North Pole and nobody lives there, that's not going to lead to displacement or disaster. It has to engage or relate to the vulnerability people have and the exposure. So when you think about our policy options in terms of reducing the risk of displacement, we can clearly do something with the hazard. Maybe not with the earthquake, that geophysical hazard, that's very hard to counter. But we can clearly do something about global warming and sea level rise, for example. We can strengthen mitigation. So we can do something about the hazard. We can do clearly something to strengthen resilience and vulnerability, or reduce vulnerability. We can make people more resilient to withstand the hazard. And one very good example are housing. You know, in Kathmandu and DC, correct me if I'm wrong, there were certain houses that fell apart because they were not sufficiently resilient to the shock, whereas other could withstand the shock. And then exposure, and that's very important. There will be, unfortunately, places where people should not have human settlements. And if I were a property developer in Guyana, in Georgetown, and we had a colleague there explaining, I would not invest in human settlement in that area. So we need to also make sure that we do not build cities or human settlements or our economic activities in areas that are exposed to this hazard.
So, Atle, you mean like the policies should be inclined towards the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, both government on the one hand, and I feel climate empowerment, like people, the citizens should know like the risks and the adverse impacts of climate change. So like there are indigenous ways, you know, these days, like people have the indigenous ways of mitigating and the challenges, like their local ways, local adaptation methods and all. So I think that also could contribute to reducing the hazard and the vulnerability.
Excellent. I really like climate empowerment. I think climate change will be one of the major issues that will define our future. It's already defining it for almost at least millions of people, maybe not billions yet, but climate empowerment, we need to fix and combat climate change as it is defined in the Sustainable Development Goal number 13. So I see, Abdullah, awareness matters, exactly. Super. So then this is a little theoretical explanation of what we can do in terms of which policy buttons to push. And the next slide gives an overview, if Marion can do that, of some of the global policy tools we have at our disposal, where there is stronger recognition of the importance of including disaster displacement in the policy response. And this is just for you to illustrate that we have a lot to work on. We are not in a black hole or in a vacuum. So the Nansen initiative I've already mentioned, that's a stated initiative that predated the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and it culminated with the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, which was endorsed by more than 100 countries in 2015. So that's a policy tool which very much spells out how do we work on the hazards, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So that is one tool. Two other tools I would like you to be aware of, and now I'm going to move more into the cross-border legal protection aspect of the lecture or the session, is the Global Compact for Migration, the GCM, and the Global Compact on Refugees. These are two global policy tools that were adopted in 2018, and both of them, to some extent, do include a provision that can better help us to protect people that are moving across international border and provide protection. So these are two aspects I will come back to: the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugee on the top side of the slide. We shall not forget that we, and I think DC also illustrated that, how can we empower and build resilience? And we have quite a lot of other very important policy tools that are adopted at the global level and reflects policy commitment. One fantastic tool is the SENDA Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2013. And this is a commitment to manage risk better and build resilience. So that's a tool we shall not forget, that there's so much we can do to reduce the risk of displacement through disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management policy options. If you go to the lower level, we see the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think DC also said that, how can we ensure that there's climate empowerment? But don't forget that the key objective of the convention from 1991 is to reduce greenhouse gas emission and avoid global warming. And one of the single most important thing we can do going forward to reduce the risk of displacement is to combat climate change. Unfortunately, we are not able to do that. So we are already increasingly required to do more adaptation, and we see more loss and damage. But the framework convention from 91 and the Paris Agreement remain pillar in our fight to combat climate change. And you will have seen on the news that what's coming out of Baku and the Conference of the Parties in Baku is not very promising because parties cannot agree. But that's the single most important thing we have. And what's very important to have in mind when anyone starts to criticize the United Nations Framework Convention is that without the convention, without the Paris Agreement, we would have been in a much worse place today. Global warming would have been much higher. And I also want to highlight the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's where we all want to be, and the role of human rights. So this gives us also, or to you, a little flavor of the global policy landscape and what we can do, or what we have to work with when we are aiming to reduce hazard, reduce vulnerability, reduce exposure, and also protect disaster displaced. I don't know, Marion, are there any questions coming up now?
Yes, there is one from Kyrie Osborne. I don't know if you can take the floor. First, we had Shamir Brown. Shamir, can you take the floor? Can you open your mic? He was wondering which one. Okay, you can?
Yeah, good morning. Good
Great.
morning. Thank you so far. It's been a great presentation so far. But what I wanted to ask is, looking at these frameworks and guidelines that are there, which one of these actually provide support for workers in dealing with this sort of activity, given the fact that when persons are forced to migrate, workers have to deal with them. Workers have to help them, process them. Are there protections, global protections for workers that exist? Because what we are now seeing is that a number of countries are putting in place laws to so-called address what they say is illegal immigration. So I'm just asking, what from a labor standpoint, being a trade unionist, what are some of the laws that are in place that can protect workers based on what I'm seeing here that you've outlined?
Thank you. That's excellent. So within the Global Compact for Migration, under Objective 5, there are provision related to pathways and also labor migration pathways. So there is something there to work on. And being an ILO course, I'm not that familiar with all ILO conventions, but there are clearly ILO conventions that can be used. But the Global Compact for Migration is clearly a tool to refer to the Objective 5 and some of the policy instruments that are listed there. So there is something there. Interestingly, we also have, of course, the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their family. The problem with that convention is that it's not universally ratified, or it has very little sign-up, or relatively little sign-up, and it doesn't really speak to the specific circumstances of climate change and disaster. So it's silent on that. So it might not be applicable, but these are two policy tools you can think of. But having said that this is an area where we have gaps. This is relatively unregulated and underdeveloped. So this is where we have to work on that. And this is very much what we are promoting. So that's the best I can give you on this, and happy to give more detailed information on this, but I also hope ILO colleagues have covered this earlier in this course. I'm looking at Marion a little.
Thank you, Atle. We have a session tomorrow specifically with Federico Negro, who works in the ILO Action Program on Crisis and Post-Crisis in Geneva, and he will be it will be a session dedicated to the ILO tools and convention. So this will be addressed. Also, we have Rezel Melville, who's writing us about the ILO Caribbean, who's working with countries and constituencies since 2019. Rezel, do you want to explain it, taking the floor? Can you take the floor?
Sure, very, very quickly.
Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. I was just, of course, reading the comments and really engaged in the conversation. To point out that indeed, when we look at what can we do, the ILO Caribbean office has been focusing on supporting the Caribbean countries. Our office actually serves 22 countries and territories in the Caribbean sub-region, a mix of both island states as well as continental countries. And of course, each of these tend to have or to be experiencing the impact of climate change in various ways. And so one of the things that we realize is that in much of the discourse and interventions on climate change, there was very little targeted attention to the impact on the labor markets. Of course, the pandemic brought that into full focus. And so we would have been, even during the pandemic, working with several countries to see how do we begin to incorporate and properly integrate labor concerns into the climate change and disaster risk mitigation and risk adaptation policies and frameworks. So that's been ongoing work, which actually requires us to address a lot of the fundamental principles and rights at work to strengthen not only legislative frameworks and policy frameworks, but also the institutions in these countries that, have the responsibility for ensuring compliance with the laws, etc. So the final thing I wanted to say is that currently we're actually about to launch a just transition project in Jamaica that looks at embedding climate justice, or rather that looks at ensuring social justice concerns and issues are addressed in their climate adaptation framework. So one of the first things is actually responding to the mandate to ensure that labor concerns are properly reflected in the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions. So, a lot of exciting work already happening and on the horizon. And we really are grateful for this particular training to build our capacity in the region to address the issues. So that's my 2 cents for today.
Thank you, Rachel. That's excellent, and congratulations. And I think when I was listening to is also a message I really want to highlight, that these different policy frameworks need to speak to each other. So if you want to ensure just transition for migrant workers, you need to look at what we do within the Climate Change Convention around adaptation. But if you don't have safe, regular, and orderly pathways, you will fall short. So that's a message that this is a very complex area where the policy areas need to speak to each other. And one challenge is that we are organized along policies. So we have ILO, and we have International Organization for Migration, we have United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and we need to make these international agencies speak to each other, bring these policy frameworks together. But we also know that governments are organized along functional responsibility. So you have Ministry of Climate that doesn't necessarily speak to Ministry of Labor. I may be mistaken, but very often you see these ministries. I see, Rachel, are you nodding or exactly? And so that's a challenge. So, but a first start could be have a knowledge of what these framework are saying. So that's excellent, Rachel. Thank you. Any burning questions? We have 19 minutes left. I think I need to move a little quicker, and then we can wrap up.
We'll do that.
Yeah. So this brings me a little to the second part of it, and I will concentrate only on the second part. I will not include the third part, but it will stay there in the PowerPoint, and you can look at it. It will basically be a reinforcement on what I say in this second part. So now we move a little to narrow down. Now we will talk about what happens when people move an international border and they are compelled to move. And that means we may have failed on the risk reduction, resilience, preparedness, and adaptation. So we are now into what type of protection can then be offered. And the key message for me is that there is very little. There is actually, if you are compelled to move to another country and you seek protection in another country, there is a very few category of people that are entitled to that protection, meaning that the receiving states have an obligation to receive you. You will have to be most likely an asylum seeker or a refugee or entitled to complementary protection under human rights law. If you are outside of that scope, you will probably have to either come in on a labor migration visa, student visa, or other. There are no obligation on receiving states to receive you. So that's a legal gap. My next slide shows the definition of a migrant. And I will do this quite quickly. I just wanted to highlight that one option, even if you are in the absence of legal international standards that put obligation on how states receive other country citizens, of course, a lot of movement happens under migration governance. Go back one. And I already referred to the Global Compact for Migration, which is more a policy instrument. It's not even soft law. So there are opportunities for people moving in the context of disaster and climate change, moving across international border, to be covered by the policy instruments in the Global Compact for Migration. So I'll come back to that. But that is something which gives us an opportunity to engage with states and seek inspiration. So that's from a migration point of view. If you turn to refugee law, and the next slide gives you the definition of who is a refugee. And we already talked about we should be careful about applying the climate refugee concept. But the fundamental point I'm trying to make here is that the 1951 Refugee Convention and the protocol from 1967 they are silent on climate change. So that means if you are supposed to have international protection for being asylum seeker or meeting some of the definitional grounds in the Refugee Convention, and you need to meet these definitional grounds. Sorry, I was a bit unclear. So a refugee, according to the 51 Convention, is someone who's unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And that means if you are compelled to move due to a disaster, if you are compelled to move because your livelihood is gone, sea level rise makes it impossible to stay where you are, there's very little in the Refugee Convention that will allow you any type of protection. That will be very arbitrary and unpredictable. So that suggests there is limited, or there is little we can expect from that protection framework, although the Refugee Convention can be applied. So that means we are in the face of a legal gap, and the next slide tries to explain that. If Marion can go to the next slide, please. So the legal gap is if a person is forced to cross a border in the context of disaster and climate change, they will have limited protection. At least they will have limited predictable protection when they arrive in another country. There is no right to migrate, or there's no right to be admitted as a migrant, for example, in another country. So there's limited protection. Because in most cases, they will not be recognized as a refugee, international refugee law. And human rights law does not give anyone the right to be admitted and to stay in another country. We also, I mentioned the Migrant Workers Convention is also very silent on climate change and disaster. So we are faced with a legal gap that will make protection unstable, maybe arbitrary, and very uncertain if you are compelled to move to another country. So the next slide tries to summarize this in a table, trying to explain the protection framework and protection gaps in situation of disaster displacement or people moving across borders in the context of disaster and the worst effect of climate change. I've added internal displacement at the top just to illustrate that there are very strong protection framework when people are within the borders of their own countries, primarily for the very simple reason that they are citizens of that country. So they enjoy all the human rights that any other citizen or habitual resident of that country. And we also have some fantastic regional instruments, such as the Kampala Convention for the Protection of IDPs in Africa. And of course, many countries have IDP laws and policies. So you could argue there is not really a legal gap. But when you're talking about cross-border disaster displacement, there is really not any normative framework existing. As I've argued, the Refugee Convention is not really applicable because people moving in these contexts do not meet the criteria of the Refugee Convention that describes who is a refugee and entitled to international protection. There are regional protection framework, but they're also narrow in the definition of who is a refugee. If I had more time today, I would have explained to you the Cartagena Declaration from the Americas. So that will stay in the slide deck that will be shared with you. And please come back to me on that. The potential of the regional protection framework is that they have a wider definition of who is entitled to protection under the law. So both in Africa, the African Union Refugee Convention and the Cartagena Declaration broaden the scope of people that can be protected. It doesn't only refer to well-funded fear of persecution. If you are compelled to move due to breakdown of public order, for example, you may be entitled to protection. I mentioned the two global compacts and invite you to look particularly into Objective 2 and 5 of the Global Compact for Migration. There are policy instruments that can give indication to state how they can receive and admit people moving in the context of disaster and climate change. And I already mentioned a convention on the protection of the rights of all migrants, workers, and members of their family, which has limited ratification or signatories, and is also quite silent. So there are some elements that can guide states to provide protection. And some elements that limits the limitation. So what can we do in the absence of a strong international legal framework in this area? The major point I want to make, and I hope you will remember this, that even in the absence of international framework or obligation of states to admit and let people stay, states are already admitting and let people stay using a wider range of tools. And the next slide gives you an indication of these tools that states have enacted and implemented. So how to protect people on the move? This is what states already do. Some states do have migration law that includes the category of people moving or compelled to move due to environmental reason or disaster. So particularly in Americas, we have several countries that have this included in the national migration legislation. So that is an opportunity to provide protection to people moving in this context. We know that some countries have applied exceptional migration measures. These are, for example, humanitarian visa or temporary protection. So that's also a tool that can protect people in the context of disaster and climate change. And maybe that refers a little to what I said, a bed for the night, maybe an emergency measure if people need to cross an international border, maybe they're in need of medical assistance and can return back. So there are also a possibility to turn to exceptional migration measures such as humanitarian visa and temporary protection. A third area, which we shall not underestimate, is human rights law or complementary protection. There will be situations where it is not permissible to move people back to their country of origin because of extreme environmental degradation if people's life and physical integrity is at risk, and particularly if it refers to children. So human rights law can also provide inspiration and guidance on how to admit people that are compelled to move across international borders. In the Caribbean and also in Greater Horn of Africa, we do have example of free movement of person mechanism. So Organization for Eastern Caribbean States have promoted the use of free movement of person in disaster setting. That allows people to cross international border. And in the IGAD region, in Greater Horn of Africa, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, there is a free movement of person protocol that is increasingly signed and ratified by countries that has an Article 16 related disaster situation. And finally, somehow contradictory to what I've tried to convey throughout this session, don't forget refugee law. Many circumstances and situations will lend itself to the application of refugee law, and even more so, regional refugee law, particularly the Cartagena Declaration from 1984 and the African Union Refugee Convention from 1969. So these are tools that states have been using and which we are promoting its scale up. And that leaves us about 8 minutes to have an exchange on these last points. So I saw there was some question about 51 convention, so maybe we can get back to those questions. But this is our last moment to talk about this. I will put my email in the chat box. So I also invite anyone that might have further questions or would like to continue the discussion. I'm happy to have that. And also, I'm inviting you to look at our website, because these different tools I just explained is the essence of what we are promoting and guiding states on. We're guiding states on how do you employ some of these tools that you have in front of you. The third part of the session today I have dedicated to an interesting process under the Cartagena 40+ process. So you will have the slides, and that's something you may want to follow, because there's some very innovative development in the Americas related to the Cartagena Declaration. But maybe, Marion, you can go back to the slides with protected people on the move, and then we stay there for the remainder of this session.
Okay, so I think, I don't know if DJ wanted to take the floor, I think, but we have several questions or comments, I mean, not like in the last minutes, but Yes, there was a question from Abdullah Hamar. He wanted to know, what do you think or expect about the recognition of the terms legally by states, or specifically by those countries who signed the Geneva Convention of 1951? Of course, in the future, thinking of current debates and maybe insights from your participation in the COP29, the terms such as climate refugee or climate migrant. These questions refer to that. Go ahead.
Maybe we take them one by one. So
yes, exactly.
We are sure to take each. I think there's very little interest politically to do anything at the global level. For example, change the refugee convention, and that's a political reality. It's also probably a risky endeavor, in the sense that that's very solid international protection framework for refugees. Any attempt to open that refugee convention will probably lead to lower standards. So we should maybe stay away from doing that. But that's essentially a political argument. So that's up to you to accept or not. But I think the major point is that it might not be a good idea to have a global protection tool for this, because circumstances are so different. And so we need different tools for different circumstances. So personally, I think much more promising in what we see at regional level, that regional organization and countries coming together to develop standards at the regional level. And we see that all over the world. The Pacific now have a regional climate mobility framework. We have the Cartagena 40 plus process in the Americas. We have pre-moving the person protocol in the IGAD region. So my faith or hope is to strengthen at least the regional level, because then circumstances are quite similar. And also never forget the power of having strong national predictable legislation on this. We also have to work at the national level. So these are my few cents on that.
Thank you, Atle. We have Wanya Iles, who cannot speak live. So she's, the question is that one. Since the Global Compact on Migration was developed, what have been some successes achieved? What are some quick wins that SIDS can get from this, and also focus on immediately in terms of their own vulnerability and being able to respond to migratory flows?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one to talk about the Gs, and these are a long-standing process, and I think the COVID endemic or pandemic also complicated some of the progress there. So I'm a bit reluctant to talk about progress. I think the importance of the GCM is that it's recognized. It's very clearly recognized that people are moving for a variety of reasons, and people will be compelled due to disaster and climate change. And it spells out a set of policy instruments, particularly in Objective 5. So it's a huge opportunity to strengthen that. Whether this has really had any impact on the ground, we need to look from place to place. But I do think that, for example, the Cartagena 40 plus process have nurtured some of its broadening scope from, for example, the 2 global compacts. So this is a very step-by-step process, and I think that's the best I can give on that questions. I think we all have to assess progress according to our own criteria, but I'm a firm believer that the Global Compact for migration in particular was a breakthrough. It's going to stay with us forever, and we have to make it as powerful as we can.
Okay, so and there's also a lot of interest from Shamir and also from Wanya about what's the work being done at the COP to address the gaps, and what are the immediate takeaways from the COP in filling these gaps. So the both questions go to the same topic.
Yeah, I think some of the progress in the Conference of the Parties was at least documented last year. So there's a stronger recognition of loss and damage, and the fact that people will have to move or be compelled to move. So in the last Conference of the Party, we had a fund being established, we had a network for catalyzing assistance, and there is an architecture that is evolving. The COP in Baku is not over yet, but it's not very encouraging in the sense the signals coming back, and we will have to see what they are able to land on. But I do think we have to recognize that probably the next conference of the parties in Brazil will be more advanced on that. But there is maybe the same argument with the Global Compact for Migration. The issues have been recognized. There is an evolving or emerging support architecture around this, and that's something that will never go away. But we have to remember, although these framework needs to speak to each other, safe, regular, and orderly pathways are not being covered by the Framework Convention. That we need to fix in other policy areas, such as the Global Compacts or regional migration governance work.
Thank you, Atle. It was a very rich session, a lot of questions. So yes, we had indeed almost 20 participants connecting. Thank you so much to all of you. Lots of questions. So we will your email will be available. The whole presentation by tomorrow will be on the eCampus. So if they want to, the participants can reach out for other questions they might have. So thank you so much. I will let you go. I just need to make a quick announcement to the participants. Thank you for your availability just coming back from the COP.
Thank you so much. And this was very exciting. I'm sorry we couldn't be in the same room. That would have made it much richer, but good luck to everyone. And thank you for your great questions. This was very energizing. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Atle. So I have a question about the group work from Kerry Osborne from Jamaica. Regarding the group assignment, the instruction given was that we must advise or communicate who we choose for the ambassador of our group. Can you please advise who we are to contact email? So you can write to me, no problem, to me and Mickey. I think for the rest, Atle was able to answer to basically all the questions. But as he has given you his email, and I will put it also in the eCampus, you can reach out to him if you have other questions. Also about the third part of the presentations that you will find in the eCampus by tomorrow. I will put it right after the closure. So we have another session tomorrow, as I said, with our ILO colleague Federico Negro. And it will be tomorrow, it will be at 8 a.m. CET. So, okay, you want my email? Okay, yes, I can. Yes, of course, I can put it here. Okay, this is my email. Okay, so thank you. I thought we had adjusted the times. I don't know, Shamia, what you mean.
No, I thought that we had gone to 1400 hours instead of the 8. It's very difficult. It's 2 a.m. in the morning for the 8.
Yes, I understand.
CET.
Yes, I mean,
So,
we know the group is so different and speakers are not available when we ask them. I mean, it's not always easy, but tomorrow it will be 8 a.m. So I guess for you it will be better. For others it will be worse. I mean, I'm sorry, you are a group from very different geographical locations. So thank you for staying up so late, Shamia. So we will meet you tomorrow, and anything you need, you can reach out by email. Okay?
all right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, DJ, also for your active participation, and also for the ones who couldn't take the floor. Thank you to have written in the chat box.
Thank you.
Bye. Until tomorrow.
Thank you, Atlas and everyone. Thanks.